Good evening, everybody. We're going to get started. My name is Michelle December. I'm the Director of Learning and Engagement at CAM, and I'm really thrilled to welcome you to tonight's talk with Ebony G. Patterson. We're so honored to host Ebony's work in her exhibition, When the Cuts Erupt, the Garden Rings, and the Warning is a Wailing. It's on view now at CAM through February 21st, and if you haven't had a chance to see this really incredible work, I hope that you'll grab a time ticket and come check it out. I recently moved to St. Louis, and I've been kind of behind the scenes on some of our virtual programs. So it feels like a really perfect opportunity to kind of say hello to all of you on this occasion of celebrating a St. Louis and Wash U alum. So welcome, Ebony. Tonight's hour-long program is going to be facilitated by our chief curator, Wassan Al-Khudhairi, who curated the exhibition. And she's going to be in conversation with Ebony and sharing images of her work for about the next 40 minutes or so. And then we'll have time at the end for questions. Because Wassan is so great at creating a really intimate environment for us, it's going to be a kind of conversational tone tonight. So we encourage you to ask questions and to do so through the Q&A box. The chat function's also open, so if you wanted to drop some love in for Ebony or for her show, for her work, you're welcome to do that. We just ask that if you want to pose a question to Wassan and Ebony, that you do that through the Q&A function so that Wassan can see it. That's the way that she'll be able to see your questions. There's also closed captioning being offered tonight, and you can turn that off through the subtitle, the CC button that's at the bottom of your webinar. There's an option to turn off the subtitles. And we'll be recording tonight so that if you know someone who couldn't make it tonight, we have a really lovely turnout, but if someone you know couldn't make it, please feel free to send them the link. We'll have it up in the website in the next few days. So without further ado, I'm excited to pass it over to my friend and colleague, Wassan. Take it away.
Hello, everyone. This is always a really exciting opportunity for us to present, I think, artist talks as part of our program at CAM. So I'm going to let this video loop in the background as I introduce our special guest this evening. So welcome all to virtual CAM. Tonight I'm really excited to welcome Ebony G. Patterson. And before we launch into our conversation, I want to make a couple of notes about Ebony's wonderful accomplishments. Ebony G. Patterson was born in Kingston, Jamaica, and she currently lives and works between Kingston and Chicago. Her solo exhibitions and projects have been shown at many US institutions, including the Baltimore Museum of Art, the Studio Museum in Harlem, the Atlanta Contemporary Art Center, and the Savannah College of Art and Design. Her touring exhibition, While the Dew is Still on the Road, premiered at the Perez Art Museum in Miami and traveled to the Speed Art Museum in Louisville and is currently at the Nasher Museum of Art at Duke University. Patterson's work is included in a number of public collections, including the Studio Museum in Harlem, Perez Art Museum, Museum of Arts and Design, Nasher Museum of Art, Speed Art Museum, Brooklyn Museum, Virginia Museum of Fine Art, Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, the Art Gallery of Ontario, and the National Gallery of Jamaica. Patterson received a United States Artist Fellowship in 2018 and the Stone and DeGuire Contemporary Art Award from her alma mater, Washington University in St. Louis. Prior to receiving her MFA at the Sam Fox School of Design and Visual Arts at Washington University in St. Louis, Patterson attended the Edna Manley College in Kingston, Jamaica, where she received a BFA in painting. In the coming year, Patterson will be a resident artist at the Joan Mitchell Center in New Orleans, a participating artist in both the Liverpool Biennial and the Athens Biennial, and she will have her first exhibition in Europe at the Kunsthal Art House in Denmark. So help me everyone in virtually welcoming Ebony G. Patterson. Ebony, unmute yourself.
Hi,
welcome
Wassan.
to this weird
Thanks so much.
thing.
Hi, everyone. Thanks so much for having me.
Yeah, this is a treat that you still have not come to St. Louis to see the exhibition. in person, but that will hopefully soon happen before the exhibition closes in February.
You guys just need to do better and get off that required quarantine list. That's why we can't. That's why I can't come sooner.
Can't say we're working on it, but I want to believe that it will happen
Fingers
soon.
crossed.
So we've put together some images to share with everyone tonight to give people a sense of, you know, what the exhibition looks like and what some of the works are in the show. And so I'll be kind of scanning through those as we talk, and we can always kind of go back and forth. So you let me know. So Ebony, I wanted to start with a kind of big open question for you. And it's all about gardens. So your practice is really centered around the garden, and the garden has played a really important both kind of physical and metaphysical space, and serves as a metaphor for a lot of your practice. Can you talk about how that came to be, and why you keep returning to the garden as this place to kind of explore in your work?
Well, I think I came to the garden, or came to gardens from multiple points. One, because my work has always been centered on thinking about dress and pageantry and the employment of these tools by working class people. And particularly thinking about like Black working class people and how these tools are used as a way of carving bodies that ordinarily would not be seen as bodies that have power socially, how those tools are then employed. And then, you know, like I always say, like, when I think about something, I always first think to my initial experiences. So in Jamaica, for example, a lot of working class spaces have names that relate to the land. It relates to a kind of grandness of space, but then so do upper class spaces. And I noticed that was also something that was very similar that was also happening here, for example, in the US. So you might have a place called, say for example, there's a work that I made that was called the Of 72 Project, which in many ways attempted to memorialize state killings that had happened in 2010 in a community called Tivoli Gardens. When we think about, you know, like the word garden, and we think about like the history of, you know, like the idea of a garden as a site, and then thinking about spaces like Tivoli, those two things almost seem kind of opposite. Or say, for example, somebody in an interview I had with a writer in St. Louis, he also mentioned to me that where Mike Brown, the community that Mike Brown had lived in was called, I think it was like Canefield Green or something like that. So again, there's this connection to land and kind of thinking about like the land as a site of aspiration. And then also to thinking about like, you know, how that then also relates to the body and the way one decorates and adorns the body is the same. There's kind of like a call and response to that in the way that we decorate and dress the land that exists around our domestic spaces. The other thing that also happened too was after my father had passed, I noticed that the language or the word death started to enter my work even more. There was always a kind of an undercurrent in the conversation around violence, but the word death became even more central. And it took me a long time to realize how much the language of memorialization around death had become centered. And so I found that I was like always placing, now the figures were always being placed on the floor or on the ground. And I was always shrouding them. So while in earlier works, the figures were standing, there was kind of like this confrontational gaze or confrontational posture. There was still, yes, there was a lot of like, you know, hyper embellishment, hyper decorativeness, and this kind of, you know, kind of difficulty in reading where the background starts and these bodies that are standing and facing us are. But then what happens then when that same language, that language of embellishing continues to be employed, and now the figures are on the ground. And so around the time my father had died, I somehow became even more hypersensitive to images of death, and then noticed, became even more acutely aware of images of people that had died violently that were in circulation on social media. And just the notion that people would click like and share was also strange to me. Click like, share, and comment. Quite often, again, these images were people of color, these were working class people. And then I was also thinking, you know, like, here it is, social media creates a kind of visibility for ordinary people to be visible. But then what does it mean when these bodies from these same spaces that are, you know, that are oppressed bodies then get clicked, liked, and shared, their images, the images of death and the violence that has happened to them, that in many ways each of us by virtue are participating in a continued violence, right? So I started like thinking about these images and kind of using this idea as a point of reference in laying these figures down. And then quite often too, the other thing I would notice is that a lot of the images, they were often of bodies that were, the bodies were often like discarded in the bush, and that somehow, again, the landscape became another way of concealing this horrible atrocity that had happened. And so it was, you know, like enshrouding the bodies in the work and then also shrouding the space. It just seemed like I was like physically trying to bury, you know, bury these bodies within the work. And then somebody had a friend of mine, Pat Saunders, had introduced me to Olive Senior's work. Olive Senior is a poet from Jamaica. She's lived in Canada for a number of years, and she wrote this really beautiful suite of poems called Gardening in the Tropics. And it's all about violence on the land, of the land, and from the land. And there's this really amazing poem called Brief Lives that pictures this this garden, a kitchen garden, and thinking about like there are these two meetings. There's a young man who's described as somebody who escaped or who had left his like rural home and had come to the city to seek opportunity, but had gotten caught in like turf violence. But this woman who has this kitchen garden, and when we think about the act of gardening as a kind of middle upper class activity, here it is that there are these two meetings of two social classes. And the line that always held me was in the poem was, she buries him again so he could carry on growing. That even in death, she recognized the value of this young man's body, even though the larger society wouldn't see his body as being valuable.
Okay. You said a lot of really good things. I think it would be
a really long-winded response.
Yeah.
Sorry.
No, it's good.
Sorry.
We touched on a lot of things.
But yeah.
I want to drill down on a little bit for
Sure.
those that are listening. because I know that, you know, having known you and your work for a long time now, you know, I think the more I speak to you, the more things become open, they open up and they become clearer for me. So I kind of want to take a couple of things that you've said and drill down a little bit on them. So you talked about embellishment. You talked about embellishment in the way in which we adorn ourselves, but also embellishment in the way in which we might adorn or care for gardens. And I wanted to kind of bring up this point that your work, in a way, it plays a bit of a trick on the viewer, I think, in that there is all this beautiful embellishment. There are these colors and glitter and shiny and things that really draw you in. But then once you kind of get roped in, I feel like all of these difficult truths emerge. Is this a sort of intentional strategy of yours in how you think about building these works, or is it something subconscious that sort of happened more sort of naturally for you? How did you come to working in this kind of way?
I mean, so it's twofold, right? So yes, there is a strategy. It is strategic. It is incredibly intentional. I mean, earlier I used to use this idea of like the bee and flower, thinking about it as a kind of bee and flower syndrome. You know, the bee is attracted first to the color of the flower, and it's not until it gets inside that it decides, oh, you know, I'm gonna sit around and like, you know, yum, 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 pollen. But like, you know, and I remember like I had such an amazing like foundational experience as a young artist when I was in Jamaica. I had a teacher that used to tell us all the time that, you know, the attention span of the viewer is really short. Back then, he used to say the attention span of the viewer is like 3 seconds, and what you do with those 3 seconds are really, really important. So what is the thing, or what do you do in order to hold the viewer's attention that's somehow going to get them to sit around a little longer and dig a little further? I'm thinking about that on like multiple layers or multiple levels. And these days I almost think like the bee and flower thing might be a little too sweet, you know? I'm trying to think about ways in which somehow the beauty of it all could become somehow sickening. That it's so beautiful that its beauty becomes a little difficult or a little cringy. It's like you had too much candy and it's now in the back of your throat and you can't get away from that annoying taste. So that, I mean, that's my aspiration. And that's kind of where I'm working towards. So at first, I think that like the fussiness in the surface also too came from a place of like, I think about myself as a painter. People always are kind of surprised by that. But I think it just goes back to like, you know, the way I came to thinking about art formally, or the way that I was trained as a painter. So I'm always really concerned with how much, you know, how much sumptuousness there is, or is possible on the plane. In my like formative years, I used to use oil paints and, you know, like an acrylics, and some of my favorite painters, you know, like I always love like the meatiness of something. So in many ways, I'm attempting to create meat on the surface, something that gives the viewer something to salivate on, but then in salivating, in like going, oh, this is so nice. And then all of a sudden, like you're seeing a cockroach, you know, popping out. It's like, whoops, like, is it really nice? Or, you know, there are limbs that are like coming out of or oozing from the surface, or seeing like eyes peeping out, you know. So I'm going, you know, like I'm trying to go between all of these moments within the work that holds the viewer. In some ways, I feel like I'm thinking more and more, what I want to really create is like a Venus flytrap. I think I'm almost like at a Trojan, like a kind of Trojan horse kind of place, you know? But what I want is like a fly trap. You get so sucked in that, you know, by the time you realize what's happened, it's too frigging late.
You talked about it a little bit earlier, but I think it would be helpful if you could talk a little bit more about why the bodies in the work are never fully complete. This sort of tension between the visibility and the invisibility.
I missed the first word, sorry. Why, what isn't complete, sorry.
Why the bodies in your work are never fully complete.
And
I think, you know, when you look at the works, you can often find parts of bodies. Sometimes you can almost see the entire body, but there's never really a head, I don't think. So can you talk about why you're doing that? Because you can definitely make something less visible but still have, you know, a full body. And so I wondered if you could just sort of drill down on that a little bit more for us.
Yeah. I mean, I for me, it's like they're kind of like notes on violence. So how do I talk about violence without going into gore or going into a kind of porn? And it's a difficult line to kind of to straddle, right? Because while there is violence, I'm also like trying to also suggest that even in these kind of moments of violence, people are still finding ways, and they will always find ways because that's what people do. So it's my way at kind of at hinting at that, while also playing with this language of like what's visible and invisible. The other thing also too is that when you know, like when there's this kind of dismembering, there also becomes a question of who this could be, as opposed to when it's very clear who it is, then it becomes about that person. And then when it becomes about a singular individual, in many ways there's an opportunity to create distance between the viewer and what they're looking at. Like, oh, this is about that person over there. And so what I'm attempting to do is somehow find a way that there is that there becomes like a kind of ownership in the discovery. Like that could be so and so, that could be this person, that could be that person. And so these are like my attempts at doing that.
Okay. I want to go back to this work, when the land is in plumage. The thing that I'm really interested, one of the metaphors that you make a lot with the garden is the one about transformation. This idea that things have to kind of die in order for other things to grow. This sense of kind of like shredding and growing and collapsing of ideas and materials, and it all kind of becomes this meditation on transformation. Can you talk about your intentions behind a work like this, and why transformation feels pressing or important to you right now?
So I came to you. I think it's also like, let me just wheel it all back. So last year, I was home in the summer when I'm always home. And I often go to the zoo at home over the last number of years, just kind of watching, like watching how it's gone from different hands and so on. So it's always been a place that I go to. The zoo is in a historic garden. But last year there was something about looking at that space that became very different for me, because I had just come off of being at a residency at Crystal Bridges, where I spent time making a number of works, and then also too, while making these works on paper, I also planted a physical garden, and it was a garden that was meant to live and die. And it was a garden that had plants with poisonous properties and healing properties, and it was just meant to withstand the elements, or not withstand, but to see how it would thrive. So it wasn't cared for. There was no weeding, there was no watering beyond the initial watering after it was planted. And it sat there for a number of months. After doing the residency, then I had gone to the New York Botanical Gardens, because we were talking about the possibility of doing something there. And I was like, oh, well, what was here? What was here? What was it? You know, like just asking, what was here? And then I went home, and then all of a sudden, then I started thinking about like, well, what was here? Just kind of thinking about this idea of like, what would happen if you could just pick the land up the same way you pick up your carpet in your home, just look underneath, like what would be revealed from lifting up the floor. So when I went to the zoo last year, I had seen a Lucine peacock, a white peacock. I'd never seen a white peacock before, and the peacock was molting. Which I'd also never seen before. And also too, I wasn't familiar with the word molting, but it was really strange. It was in a small enclosure during this period it's on its own, and it just seemed to kind of ebb and flow in this really dark enclosure as it was going through this transformation. And I'd never been able to get it out of my head. And then I was preparing for the Liverpool biennial, and I had said I wanted to do like this new floor, I wanted to do a new floor-based piece. And I thought it would be really interesting to think about this peacock metaphorically, and thinking about the land in relation to the peacock's tail. A colored peacock, the tail looks so much like the land anyway. And then I just started like looking around for peacocks for a while. I secretly, actually, for years, I would always like look at taxidermy peacocks, but could never bring myself to buy one. Anyway, so I found this peacock on like eBay, I think it was, and it was really interesting to me because the peacock was looking back at itself as opposed to looking forward. And so in making the work initially, it had like a 20-foot long tail. I really hated it and scrapped it all together and thought I should rework the work and I should make a smaller version. And the one at CAM is like my idea of a small work, which is funny. But anyway, I digress. So during the time that and it's taking really long, I'm gonna get to it. In the time that we were on lockdown, I was still working on this work for Liverpool. The exhibition had gotten postponed, like so many things, but I was still thinking about what I wanted to do. But while I was watching TV like everyone else, watching the protests, watching the burnings, watching the numbers of cases going up, watching the protests in response to the killing of George Floyd, that was like rippling around, rippling globally, and like other related police killings. I just kept thinking that the land was molting. Just seeing things burn meant that the land was actually molting. And even thinking about how that related to like, like this is also related to like slash and burn practices that like farmers have practiced for like centuries. This is the way you clear the land to bring something in new. And like there was something, like people throw the word like apocalyptic around a lot, but to me it almost seemed really biblical, and it had me thinking about like, like God had said he would never destroy he'd never destroy the earth again by water. The next time would be fire, like that kind of. So thinking about how that, how what seemed to be unraveling was a molting, but it was but this molting meant not the end, but change. So all I could think about was like, what would happen if the peacock had to face itself, like this period of ugliness, this period of change, you know? Peacock is an incredibly beautiful and vibrant bird, but to witness the bird that seems to have like all of this possibility and beauty in its ugliest of states is also really shocking to see. And so those are some of the things I was thinking about. So what would it mean to face your own ugliness, to really look at it?
Yeah. Yeah, and there's something so powerful to think about, this idea of having to kind of lose something in order to be able to come back as something else, right? This idea of going down before you can come back up again.
Right.
So one of the things about this exhibition that might mark a slightly different direction, maybe that's a little heavy-handed for your practice, but I want to talk a little bit about how these other works are made using paper. And I know that you have used paper on and off throughout your career. It's not a new material for you, but it feels like you're kind of returning to it in a different way, maybe with a different type of commitment right now. So can you talk a little bit about that? How did you come to that? Why did you choose that? I know that in some of our conversations, you've talked a lot about the material being a metaphor for the body. So can you maybe expand a little bit on that?
Yeah, sure. So after the Perez show, which, you know, like, after the Perez show, I just kept thinking, was there a way to somehow bring all of these things that I would build out in an environment into the work itself? You know, like, what if the work actually held all of the facets of the environment that I was building out? So I think just during the time I was working on the Perez show, I was also preparing for a show with my gallery in Chicago, Monique Maloche Gallery, and I had a couple of like works on paper, and a couple of those works on paper had you know, I like included these puncture holes or these cutouts, these holes that I would tear. And I mean, the tapestries that, you know, like that I've been making for years have always been based on photographs that I end up taking in the studio that are staged, and then afterwards they go through this like heavy embellished process. But I've always made here and there a couple of works on paper that were always smaller. So I've at the time of the Perez show, I was just thinking, how could I make those paper works at the same scale of the tapestries, and then at the same time hold the same kinds of sensibility that I was trying to build out in this in the installations. So I made a couple of rules for myself. So I said, one, I wasn't gonna allow myself to use any glitter. I could use one embellishment and butterflies. And so this is a rule I set up for myself as a way of like just seeing what I could do materially and to just push myself further. I'd always felt like in many ways the photographs that end up becoming tapestries had a kind of they were always really rich and always had their own sense of shine. But then in also to thinking about like the act of tearing, in many ways I felt like the way that I was ripping or cutting things also had me thinking about the paper like skin, thinking about it like puncture wounds, that these holes were also marks of violence that was happening to our body. But then at the same time, here it is, we were having things, even though like, you know, even though things seem to be in its most precarious, where the paper is punctured so much so that when it comes off the studio wall, just the slightest move would cause it to rip again, you know, like, so it's stretching the material so much that it starts to reflect the very bodies that that I've been thinking about. And so, yeah, so the decision to return to paper in this way really came out of, like, you know, really came out of rigor and wanting to, it's not so much, I'm not reframing the question, I'm just turning the question around and looking at it from another direction. And in doing that, that also helped me to, when I think about like what's been happening with the tapestries, or especially when I think about the one that's currently in the gallery with the peacock, I've been really thinking about also too, how could I also push the sense of like materiality and denseness of the tapestry to this point where it becomes almost impossible, you know, like that, even though it's, you know, like it's not particularly large in contrast to a number of other works, it's quite heavy. It requires like a lot of labor to pull, you know, even just to turn slightly. So I'm also concerned with the physicality of these things beyond their scale.
Yeah, I can confirm that it's heavy. As we try to install it, it also is. It also doesn't have like a base. You know, there is no base for it. It's very
precarious.
And you told us to just put it in like a burrito, and we were like, can't do that.
Because that's how we would have to get it in and out of the studio too. You know, like my studio door at the time was really small, even though I was like making these really massive things. I didn't care about the door. You know, my mom would always say, once you could think about it, once you've imagined it, it's possible. So I imagined getting out the door. So it was possible to get it out the door. I wasn't worried about how.
Well, but, I think the other thing about this work too that people might be interested in knowing is that, you know, you alluded to this a little bit earlier, but originally this work was not going to be in the exhibition at CAM.
No.
We selected a different work, and because COVID happened and this exhibition had to open in September instead of May, you know, you said to me on a phone call, what if I make another work? And I was like, sure, if you want to.
And this was essentially me attempting to rework this the work that was meant for Liverpool. I just felt like it was the right, I remember when I finished making it, how exhausted it all seemed. And I was like, oh, I made a work that's basically a museum scaled work. What does it mean to make this kind of, I said, isn't this a little absurd in a time when everybody's having to work from home, that I made a work from, but it just, I felt like this was a thing that I needed to do, you know? At the end, I was like, fuck no, like, you know, like this moment is big, and if this is what I feel it requires right now, then that's what it requires. And then also too, in the studio, I couldn't see it. Because the breadth of the work is the breadth of the studio. And on top of that, then I also had fragments of that work that's on the really long wall, which is 52 feet long, also in the studio. So I also couldn't see that work either. So I remember when my whole thought was like, oh, maybe I could just like use a museum as an extension of the studio to problem solve. Maybe this will help me figure out the kinks.
I think a little bit, I think that for us a little bit, that's what we want CAM to be for artists, you know, right. Because we aren't, you know, a collecting museum. We aren't, you know, the museum that is presenting the canon in that kind of way. I think we want to be a space where, you know, if this incredible work is your sort of like sketch preliminary work to get to the work that you want to make for Liverpool, that's exciting for us, I think, as a museum to be able to work with you in that kind of capacity. I'm going to jump to a question from the Q&A here. Someone has asked, does the braiding of the pearls on the back of the bird represent molting?
Yes.
Yeah. And then there was another question that came in a little bit earlier from someone that says, does ritual play a part in your work? And if so, how?
I think, well, I think sometimes I do reference, I reference ritual. It's not anything in specific. So like, for example, when I think about like acts of memorialization is a ritual or an engagement in ritual. So for example, the shells below the peacock, I often get asked questions about like, oh, what's the conch shells about? Is this like some kind of salute to you're coming from a place with water? And actually, no. When I was thinking about like a body of work called For Those Who Bear Witness, in that work, I was looking a lot for ways or different notes on memorialization. So the way like things that people would leave at sites as a way of commemorating somebody who's deceased. So I would look a lot at like public shrines, like you'd notice like street side memorials, small acts of placing, making public markers or making a public monument to somebody who we wouldn't ordinarily know. And I came across a bit of information that talked about slaves here in America that would actually use shells on grave sites to embellish, a gravesite for somebody who's deceased. And then I remember when I had gone to New Orleans, I noticed this. I noticed that, like there were always small shells sometimes placed on the site of graves and sometimes coins. And what I'd read about the shell was that the idea was that somehow the shell was supposed to transport the soul of the deceased back to the motherland. And I thought, what a poetic and really beautiful gesture. So I kind of used the shells a couple of times in this For Those Who Bear Witness. And when I came around to thinking about the peacock, and thinking about like, where does the peacock sit, and what would happen if, say, for example, if we thought about that, yes, the back end of the peacock's tail, which is up on the wall, is the land, but what's happening on the floor also too? What happens if like everything is like unfurling from under the peacock too? And so I thought that the shells were a nice way of also referencing that kind of memorialization too.
Yeah. We've talked about memorialization as something that you have been coming back to a lot in your work, which is of course connected to ideas of death and loss. And there's something that you've shared with me a few times. I hope it's okay that I'm gonna bring it up now. But it's also that you've been thinking a lot about lamentation, and you've been thinking a lot about the role of women in mourning. And you've said to me a few times something that I think is really poetic. So I'm gonna kind of re-quote you to yourself, that we enter the world through the body of a woman, and that we exit through the wailing of women. Can you talk about why this is something that you're thinking about? I mean, I kind of know because we've talked about it, but I think it'd be interesting for people to hear from you why this feels relevant and why it's something that you're thinking about now, and how it finds its way, particularly in this work. And the dew cracks the earth in 5 acts of lamentation between the cuts, beneath the leaves, below the soil is the title of this book.
I came to like thinking about that specifically because of this term in thinking about like the weight of witnessing the act. So for those who bear witness, so thinking about the vulnerability of witnessing and the weight of witnessing, who actively bears that weight, and so many times when I would look at photographs, I mean, so this, so in the same way that there was this earlier body of work that was somehow making reference to underreported killings that were circulating on social media, I was also noticing too these images of loved ones at the sites of the deceased, right? And that, the paper would, like whoever it was, whether it was an onlooker that would share these images, or, the newspaper had come to, write a report and had photographed people in their most vulnerable moment. And thinking also too about the act of photographing these people in these moments also too as an act of violence, right? Because when we think about the photograph and the power of a photograph, and then what happens then when you are not able to determine how your image goes out into the world and somebody else has determined that for you in your most vulnerable moment, something has been taken away for you in that moment. And then also, so there's that. And then many times these people are women, when we think about public engagement, like if there is a killing that has happened with the police, right? Often the spokespeople for the family is often a woman, it's a sister, it's the mother, it's the aunt. And so I was just thinking about, this notion of like coming into and exiting the world. I'd read this book called The Last Warner Woman, which is written by Kai Miller. And in the book, the protagonist, who is this, like who we see grow up, she ends up like as a young teenager working in a leper colony, in a small community, but like she ends up taking care of, I think it was about 5 or so lepers, and she would take care of their wounds by making doilies and then covering their openings, with colored doilies. And so, like it gave her great pride in seeing, like not just in seeing her work, but also in seeing how her work made these people feel. But as she got older, she also then developed this very special gift of warning, that she could somehow tell when something horrible was going to happen. And in many ways, people were afraid of what she may say, right? So when I think, like just thinking about like, when you come in, like the distress that the body goes through in order to bring a life into the world, it too is like, like people always talk about, like, I'm not a mother, but in, like when I do talk to mothers who are incredibly honest about the experience of bringing forth a human being, like that shit is violent, right? It's why people are screaming, but it's a signal that something is happening, something is rupturing, something is coming. And then when when someone dies and that same body then goes into a lament, there is something similar in the occurrence. It's again, it's another warning, but it's a warning about a body that has exited the plane. And so I was thinking about these, like these relationships, and that it all happens through the bodies of women. And then also to the idea of thinking about the land and recognizing too that the land is feminine, that the bodies also return to the feminine. And thinking about this kind of cyclical relationship, and the weight that women carry in all of this.
Mhm. Yeah, I mean, as someone who is lucky enough to be able to see these works, I think that a lot of those messages come through when you're in the space with really immersed with the works.
The other
Um,
thing also too, one more thing that we've
yeah,
never
please.
talked about actually. Um, we've never talked about this, but you know, at the very center of the panel, like the outer two panels have figures, while the center panel has suggestion of figures, right? So their shoes, their hands bursting, bursting from the environment. But the three figures that we see on repeat on the outer bands are not present in this central, are not present in the middle. And in many ways, I was kind of thinking about the challenge of the way we read a picture. I think, like we typically read from, from left to right. I was kind of thinking about this idea of one, putting an image that was dead center. That's the other thing you're always told as an artist, you want, especially as a painter, you want to put something like slightly off center. But I was interested in this idea or this possibility of the image being read from the middle out, as opposed to from left to right, or even from right to left, that it almost becomes impossible to understand because it's just so, it's so much. And so to go from this place of middle, which is almost in contrast to the others, has much less weight. It's almost like there's nothing really there. I kind of wanted to, like play or challenge the audience in the way it engaged in like this act of looking or attempting to take in all of the work.
We're getting a lot of questions, so
Oh,
I'm going to take them a little bit out of order since we're looking at this work.
okay.
I'm going to ask you a kind of combo question here. So one is about the use of butterflies throughout your work. Someone is asking, is it about revival, love? They noticed they were in clusters. And so question about the butterflies. And then as sort of a second part of that, another question about the wallpaper behind the framed work. So maybe addressing the idea of kind of creating an immersive installation that's made up of all of these components. So maybe you can talk a little bit about that.
Right. I mean, I've always made these immersive environments because I was always somehow interested in like thinking about dropping the viewer into a hole, like somehow they were somehow like in them having this really dramatic shift because of the weight of the space, that when they left that space, it would be something very difficult to unsee. I'm even interested in this idea of like making it even difficult when the work is no longer there and the exhibition is no longer there, that what was there also becomes difficult to unsee. The use of in my earlier works, the use of, I've always used butterflies, and they were always kind of like, like environmental notes or, moments of beauty. And they still are here. But I was also interested in ways in which the butterfly could also become an insidious moment within the work. So the question is, are they eating away at the paper? Are they feeding from the environment or feeding on the environment? Also, too, the other thing is that they're all monarchs. And when we think about the monarch is an endangered species. It also, its body has also evolved to thrive on a poisonous plant, which is the milkweed. And so I'm interested in these, in these kind of parallels, the idea that, the idea of like one the threat of this, the threat of the monarch as a kind of metaphor or correlation to the Black body. And then also too, thinking about this notion of threat, but that somehow the threat, that it evolves to, and feeds on it to the point where it no longer becomes threat.
We have a couple questions. I'm going to go back a little bit here. So we have a couple questions about this work, particularly, and some comments about the peacock. So we have two different people who have mentioned something which I think that you're aware of. The peacock looks back like the Sankofa Ghanaian bird, meaning go back and get it. And in this case, maybe it's meaning like retrieving its color. So I thought that was an interesting comment. And someone else says, the peacock reminds me of the Adinkra symbol called Sankofa, which means returning to the past. This idea of not forgetting one's culture or one's history. Does this resonate with you, considering the country's deep historic past of racial violence and a nod to reconciliation?
Yes, it does. It's interesting that the word Sankofa has come up. Somebody else brought this word up to me fairly recently. I mean, the truth is, I've been thinking about, like, can one really move forward if one does not acknowledge what the problem is? And it's not enough to just go, oh, that's the problem. There has to be a conversation about it. And then in having a conversation about it, solutions may come. But the idea that one does not acknowledge it it certainly doesn't move the problem, or doesn't attempt to solve it. It's part of the reason why I was really interested in having the bird look back at itself. So what does it really mean to face yourself, to face your truth in all of its senses, not just its beauty? Because the beauty is easy. What does it mean to face the tough parts, the ugliness? And so, I've just been thinking about, thinking a lot more about like this idea that the land really holds a truth. And what if we were to really begin to unpack the truth, that there could be possible, it's only in acknowledging the truth that reconciliation can actually happen.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting that across many cultures, there is a similar symbol. So there is also an ancient sort of story in Arab culture where there is a figure that's constantly moving forward, but he's looking back while moving forward. So it's interesting that is something that, finds its way in many different kind of cultures and histories around the world. So we're starting to run out of time. So I'm going to combine a question from the audience with one of my questions and a baby tag on to that to get to another question from the audience. I want everyone to feel like I got to their question. So my last question was, St. Louis, how does it feel to come back symbolically to St. Louis, where you studied, where you used to visit CAM as a student, and now you're showing a new body of work as an accomplished artist? And someone in the audience sort of attached to that is asking, did your time in St. Louis influence your art? And if so, how? And then the kind of baby tag on to that is, someone else wants to know, has your time in Chicago and or Chicago artists influenced your work? So sort of thinking about St. Louis as a place where you lived and you worked for a while, but also Chicago where you are now, and how these places might influence the way that you think or practice in making work.
I mean, so it's funny, when I was in St. Louis as a student, I don't think I fully appreciated St. Louis, because I then, like at the time, I mean, in contrast to all of the places I've lived in before coming to Chicago, I'd always lived in really small places. But yeah, I think it would be, it would be impossible for me to say that my time in St. Louis was not influential at all. Of course, yes, it was. I mean, I worked with a number of like really incredible artists while I was at the institution, a number of people who were colleagues, but I also had really great professors that encouraged me and also challenged me and pushed me. One of those people is like Joan Hall. I mean, I say Joan is the reason I ended up coming to WashU. She was the reason. And I studied printmaking. When I came to WashU, I had absolutely no idea what printmaking was. And as a painter, I actually found it painting is incredibly additive while printmaking is subtractive. And in my head, I just couldn't make sense of it. I was like, what is this madness people putting on and scraping on, you know? And then on top of that, I was, like I have always worked really large. Even when I was in undergrad, I was like making like 8-foot by 10-foot paintings. That was the nature of the school that I went to. And then coming to WashU and seeing that there was this like really strong tradition of, and in printmaking, seeing this like really strong tradition of making large scale prints was also really incredible to me, because I didn't even know that was possible. And so during the time I was there, I spent a lot of time making collagraphs, making massive collagraphs on that Peter Marcus press that, like every WashU printmaking grad with their printmaking Bible in the back of the book gets a map on how to make their own press when they leave, along with, all of the various processes that the department had worked so hard to pull together. And every year they're always adding new things. So when I was there, it was Joan, there was Lisa Belowski, there was Tom Huck and Tom Reed. And those are the people that I worked when I was there. And then also too, I worked with Jane DeLynn, who was like our seminar instructor, and Catherine Koherick, who was the head of painting during my time there. But what happened at WashU was that it also helped to push like my sense of experimentation and curiosity, and just really thinking about like the possibility that, like there were people making things that were print related, and like somehow it was always interesting to see how people were always attempting to justify something being a print. And I was like, but that's interesting, and let's see, like, and so I felt like, it just kind of opened up my eyes to understanding, like, or opening my eyes even further. Mm-hmm. That, I'm a contemporary practitioner and all materials in the world are available to me. When I, so in many ways, I would also like to think that my time in working in printmaking actually made me looser as a painter. It made me looser because, there is what you want, there's what the plate wants, but the press always wins, right? So you have to decide that you're going to respond to, it's either you're going to respond to what the press gives you, you're going to accept it, or you're going to respond to it. And so because I had to like relinquish control to, to this machine, I think in many ways it opened me up in a way that I hadn't been as open before. Not that I wasn't open, but it definitely made me more, way more open.
Okay, thank you. We've run out of time. Thank you to everyone for continuing to send questions. Unfortunately, our time is up with Ebony, so we have to wrap it up. But I just want to take a moment, Ebony, to thank you for your time, your energy, and all of your enthusiasm for our time working together on this exhibition, and for putting together such a beautiful exhibition for us at CAM to enjoy. If you live in St. Louis or live in driving distance to St. Louis, please come and visit the exhibition. We are open right now, so check the website, reserve tickets, they're free. And maybe we could all collectively give our big thanks to Ebony for your time tonight.
And I just want to say a very, very special thanks to the entire team at CAM, and an even more special thanks to you, Wassan. Thanks for working with me, and thanks for being so incredibly open in this process. I tell people, I said it last time in my last talk, do not sleep on small institutions.
Thank you, Ebony. Thank you all for joining us tonight. Everyone have a good evening. Goodbye.
Thank you. Thanks, guys. Bye.
Bye.